So, the Chinese language, right? Pretty old. The written language being over 3,000 years, as Chinese character inscriptions have been found in turtle shells dating all the way back to the Qing Dynasty, which was from around 1766 BC to 1123 BC. The language is actually divided into 5 main dialect groups, which all have their own dialects within them as well, altogether covering for more than 200 individual dialects. How did this language, especially the Mandarin dialect, which is understood by more Chinese people than any of the other dialects, come to be? To answer that, we'll first need to know where the Chinese language comes from. Well, Chinese is a Sino-Tibetan language, meaning it stems from the Sino-Tibetan language family, one of the largest family trees in the world. The Proto-Sino-Tibetan homeland was most likely somewhere on the Himalayan plateau, where many rivers have their source, like the Yellow and Yangtze River. It is believed that every language that was stemmed from Sino-Tibetan language was still considerably one language around 4000 BC. This is around the same time as the Proto-Indo-European period. So it comes from the Sino-Tibetan language family. What happened next? Next, the language would develop into Old Chinese, otherwise known as Archaic Chinese. Now, as you all know, a language is both written and spoken. In most languages, take Dutch, English, and French for example, we use an alphabet for written language, in which every letter is a sound, so the phonology of a word is quite easy to conclude, especially since those languages all use the same alphabet. In languages with a different alphabet from the one we know, it's slightly more challenging to figure out the phonology of words. But since a language still uses an alphabet, which has letters that signify how the words should sound, it's not impossible. The Chinese language, on the other hand, like Japanese and Korean to name some, is a non-alphabetic language, meaning that they have a character for every word, which also means that trying to reconstruct the Chinese phonology poses a unique problem. Even so, in Old Chinese, the vast majority of characters are constructed from two elements. One of these is called a radical, which gives a clue to what it means. The other element is a phonetic, which gives a clue to the way it is pronounced. Though it truly isn't more than a vague clue, since it can't be assumed that every character in a given phonetic series would have the same initial and rhyme. In other words, we can't be sure what it was pronounced like, though we can make and are making rough estimations based on rhyme books. All we know for certain is that this is what modern Chinese stems from. Old Chinese would branch out into Old Xia, Old Chu, Old Wumin, and Middle Chinese. Since we're more specifically looking at the Mandarin dialect, you can forget all of those except Middle Chinese, also referred to as Ancient Chinese. For Middle Chinese is where the Mandarin dialect comes from. When it comes to Middle Chinese, it's slightly less complicated since it is much easier to reconstruct. Around the time of the Tang Dynasty, which was from about 618 to 907, the Chinese actually developed a systematic way to record pronunciation. There are even dictionaries which tell us the pronunciation for every character, called a pronouncing dictionary. Yes, it really is called that. Some Chinese dialects have developed so much phonetically, though, that we cannot trace them back to the presumed Middle Chinese system of pronouncing dictionaries, which is likely why it is said that these dialects do not stem from Middle Chinese, but just from Old Chinese. This especially applies to the Min dialects of Fujian. Now, we know where the Chinese language, and thus Mandarin dialect, most likely originated, which is on the Himalayan plateau, where other Sino-Tibetic/Sinitic languages are believed to come from. We also know it would then develop into Old Chinese, something of which we have nothing other than a vague clue to guess towards the pronunciation. Old Chinese would develop into multiple things, including Middle Chinese, which is where the Mandarin dialect is believed to have stemmed from. Yet, how do we go for Middle Chinese, a dialect which lasted until about 907, to Mandarin, a dialect which is still spoken today in 2019, almost 1,112 years later? Obviously, there have been many developments in that time. Mandarin can be divided into two stages: early/old Mandarin and modern Mandarin. The early Mandarin stage would last all the way from the Yuan dynasty to the New Culture movement. For those who don't know what the New Culture movement was, it is a movement that followed the collapse of the Chinese Republic, which happened in 1912. This New Culture movement was a revolt against Confucian culture and promoted democracy. Then, to lightly explain Confucian culture, I'll quickly mention the 3 core virtues of it, which are humanness, filial piety, which is respect for one's parents, and filial devotion. Early Mandarin is very close to modern Mandarin, making it almost comparable to, say, Shakespearean English and modern-day English. We can probably understand Shakespeare in English if we try hard enough, although it sounds extremely strange to us and quite a lot different from modern day English. And unless we tried to study it almost like an entirely different language, we would not be able to speak it properly. Modern Mandarin is what we are currently being taught. The Chinese dialect has come a very long way and has changed a lot, to the point where it has dialects inside dialects, but with time and dedication has been figured out, from Sino-Tibetan to Old Chinese to Middle Chinese, to Early Mandarin, finally ending with Modern Mandarin. 再见，谢谢你的收看。